Another thing that I was wondering about is how expensive will it be for me to participate in a clinical trial? Will all my costs be billed to insurance, even if I have Medicare or Medicaid? Will they be handled by the clinical trial itself? How does that all work?
I'll take lead on that one because that's primarily my field. I will say that it's incredibly confusing, and I would not fault anyone for being confused about how even cancer treatment is billed and how it's charged to your insurance. And it is different in terms of how things are billed to Medicare or Medicaid or to private health insurance. But I will say that for clinical trials, anything that is considered within the standard of care, so for example, imaging or lab work or a drug that would be given to you for your cancer, regardless of participation in the clinical trial, that should be fully covered. If there's an experimental type of medication, it is typically covered by, for example, the pharmaceutical company that created that medication that is testing it. The things that where it gets a little bit squiggy, for lack of a better term, is that there are, potentially extra visits that, although they could be fit under the standard of care, if for some reason your insurance decides that, well, you should only be coming once a month and they're having you come every 2 weeks. That can sometimes become an issue. And it is something where I have seen patients unfortunately get bills for participating in clinical trials that were kind of a surprise. That's not to say that even if you did get a bill, though, that it wouldn't be something that could be then taken care of on the backside. But it is, it is a complicated thing. Under the Affordable Care Act, all clinical trials should be, the care provided under clinical trials should be covered under Medicare. There was recently a bill that was signed late December of last year that actually expanded clinical trial coverage to those on Medicaid. And that was a huge benefit. And that was only, again, like 4 months ago that happened. So that's a phenomenal benefit for patients on Medicaid, because those had previously been potentially excluded from all clinical trial participation. But those questions are really good questions. And sometimes it's a matter of just asking a clinical trial nurse specifically, like, okay, hey, is this going to be billed to me? Is this biopsy going to be billed to me? Is this going to be billed to the insurance? And they should be able to have all that information, because it is important and it is an essential part of clinical trial design. So for example, what is going to be billed to insurance? What is going to be billed to the study team? What investigative medications am I going to get from the study? And then what are the standard of care medications that I would be taking anyway, albeit Zofran or, a medication for any other, side effect that you may have.
Yeah, that's very helpful, especially for, potential costs that can be planned for ahead of time. What about, with uncertainty about side effects? I would imagine that sometimes there's a need to get emergency treatment and that can't be planned for ahead of time. How does that work? Is there a way to get such emergency treatment related to side effects of clinical trial drugs covered, or how is that usually handled?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say overall, the risk that you would have to need, some sort of emergency treatment from a clinical trial is low. So that's the good news. I would say overall, the treatment of your cancer as covered by your insurance should be covered by your insurance. And so if you're having a side effect related to your cancer, it should be covered by your health insurance. What sometimes gets a little sticky is if, for example, you're out of network. And your normal health insurance covers you I'm in New York, so it covers me for New York, New Jersey, but I traveled to Bethesda for a clinical trial, and I ended up in an emergency room there, and I'm out of network. Again, it can be very sticky in terms of what is going to be covered versus not covered. I will say that there usually is provisions in almost everyone's health insurance about emergency care, meaning care that you could not have forecasted, and those should be covered, because again, you're not going to negotiate where they're going to take you in the ambulance. You were obviously sick enough to be in the ambulance.
Another expense consideration, and we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, is, the need of some patients to travel for the best possible clinical trial. But how does that work? Is there ever an allowance for travel expenses included? And often it's very difficult for, someone like myself to travel on my own. Would it be a possibility to have travel expenses cover a caregiver to travel with me as well?
Yeah, those are really good questions. And I find that travel to be a really underappreciated burden, not just for clinical trials, but for cancer treatment overall. And unfortunately, many clinical trials do not cover for travel. I think, one of the huge benefits of receiving a clinical trial at the NIH is that they do cover a lot of clinical trial costs in terms of
Mhm.
travel, at least for the patient, if not for the family member. But I know, again, my personal experience is that when my husband had cancer and we were, desperately looking for a clinical trial, I found one at the time we lived in Michigan and it was in California. And I thought, okay, this is a clinical trial. Like, I can uproot my family, pay for, like airplane, hotel for myself and my husband because he couldn't travel by himself. Like, is that going to be worth it? Because I knew that generally clinical travel costs are not covered. Now, there are some charities that can help offset the costs of clinical trials in terms of, providing you some help with a plane ride or, potentially helping arrange lodging. And those are fantastic nonprofit charities, but they're sadly not guaranteed. And, there is only a certain amount of money. And so it's, the travel part of it has been a real logistical obstacle for a lot of patients.
Yeah, sometimes it's really difficult. And, in general, just living with cancer and dealing with figuring out treatment options is really difficult and often quite stressful.